Thank you. So indeed, my name is Magnus Egerstedt, and I'm a professor at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, in Georgia, in southeastern US, where I spend my time doing research and messing with education. And I'm truly honored to be given this opportunity to come and share with you some of the things that I've done on the educational front of an unusually massive scale, meaning I've been teaching these MOOCs, these massive open online courses, not because I think it's good that people are getting lazy, but I kind of wanted to know what it was, and people had all these opinions about it, and I wanted to make sure that I also had informed opinions about it. I'm also honored and happy about the opportunity to be here in Bratislava, because I've never been here before, and yesterday I walked around downtown, and it's truly a charming and beautiful city. Before we actually start, though, I want to give you a disclaimer in that I'm not a particularly profound and deep educational thinker, meaning I don't always read the latest educational research literature. I don't always have the most up-to-date tools and techniques available to me, but what I am is an experimentalist and a tinkerer, meaning when I see things that aren't working, I try to fix it. And when there are things that I think we can improve, I try to improve it. So I constantly change how I'm approaching what's going on in the learning environment and in the classroom. And sometimes it turns out really well, and sometimes it's actually miserably failing. Right? So for that reason, I'm actually going to tell you more of a story about this journey that I made through the massive open online course landscape, including the things that went well, the good and the bad, and even you're going to see the ugly as we move through this talk. But before we even start, I want to tell you a little bit about why I am where I am. So my research area is really distributed decision making and control. So given a spatially distributed collection of control nodes with locally available information, how do they structure the control actions so that the right global properties emerge? So in this case, these are 15 robots in my lab. Each robot has what's called a range sensor skirt. So this is a little infrared range sensor around it. And the robots are supposed to, in this case, spell grits. The reason for that is twofold. One is I come from, nowadays, Atlanta, Georgia, where people eat this kind of corn porridge that's called grits. I'm also the director for the Georgia Robotics and Intelligent Systems Lab, also known as GRITS Lab. So clearly that's what the robots should be spelling. But the point is, here's a bunch of robots with very limited information, and they have to assemble global structures. And the only way to do this is to do the math first, meaning there's no way you can get large teams of robots to do anything useful without sitting down and finding the appropriately Apono functions and actually doing the math correctly. So you need to actually do the theory to be able to do this. But at the same time, that's not enough, because when you put it on the robots, it always fails, always, right? Because the gap between the theorem and what the robots are actually doing is rather large. Things that you never imagined or expected will always manifest themselves. So to do multi-agent robotics, you truly need to do the math right and have a, at least, somewhat reasonable understanding of what does it mean to actually put controllers on real systems. And this, I think, is the challenge in almost all of control theory. Not just multi-agent robotics, but what happens in classrooms as well is that we have this divide that needs to be bridged. And on one side of the divide, we have people like James Clerk Maxwell, who supposedly he said, there's nothing more practical than a good theory. And I think this is very true, right? I mean, the reason we're mathematically picky and precise is not because we think we're mathematicians, it's because by being mathematically picky and precise, we can actually say things about large classes of systems. Right? We don't have to go into the particulars of a particular system. We can allow ourselves to be general, right? So we need this, both in when we do research and how we approach education. Right? But at the same time, there is another side to this bridge, where an American thinker sits. It's a baseball player named Yogi Berra. And he said, in theory, theory and practice are the same. In practice, they are not. And this is also very, very profound, because things that you think work in theory sometimes will work in practice, but more often than not, they won't, right? So how do we, as control engineers and control educators and researchers, effectively live on both sides of this nice piece of water here? I'm sure it's maybe the Danube or some other waterway here. So this is really the controls challenge. And for me, this controls challenge actually starts already at the undergraduate classes. Here is one of my biggest problems I always have when I teach. Right? Hopefully we all know what this is, right? So I teach, like many of you, every now and then, an undergraduate controls class, Introduction to Controls, right? And the students, we start with differential equations, then we take the Laplace transform, which, to be completely honest, I think Laplace didn't fully understand even, right? It's Fourier we can understand. Laplace is a little fishier. And then we learn to say things tightly about things happening in the Laplace domain. Transfer functions. Students become very good at talking about stability. They can use final value theorems for talking about step responses, for instance. So my students, like I'm going to guess most students, are rather good at reasoning about objects like this. And my homework and my quizzes and my exams are typically about the math of this and draw the Bode plot associated with that. But a few years ago, this was actually 2010, I still remember this date because I asked the students in a homework to write a piece of embedded controls code, not in Simulink, but actual microcontroller code that implemented a PID regulator. This was a homework assignment in my Laplace type Introduction to Controls. And almost uniformly, they failed. And this really, really, really bothered me because, you know, if we can reason about these things, but we don't know how to write the code for actually making these things come alive in the real world, we have no real appreciation for how do we actually tune these things. What do these mystery parameters actually mean, right? So this bothered me profoundly. I don't like this. I don't like us teaching courses about unicorns, right? Things that may or may not exist. Right? So I want to ground this. So what I decided to do as a roboticist was to the next year introduce a little bit of robotics into the classroom. So I had a very simple problem, which is students had to write embedded controls code, make the robots, actually in this case, go through a course, and then compete with each other. The maximum velocity was capped, and they had to, in this case, literally tune PID regulators to make the robots behave as well as they could. And I want to show you this video, and you can look at it, but more importantly, I want you to listen to it. So let's listen what happened in the class.
Okay, 3, 2, 1, go! That's right. Team Amy is the winner!
So I don't know what controls classes sound like in Bratislava, but very rarely, I must say, do my controls classes sound like this. I mean, I was so excited because not only were the students excited, they were arguing about whether or not they should have the I gains higher than the P gains. I mean, they truly got involved with the material by just doing this. So I had only one little example, and it was this. So now, as a good scientist, if one robotic experiment is pretty good, more robotics experiments are even better, right? Probably scales linearly, right? So the next year, same course, I added way more robotics. So now, the students were asked to solve these rather complicated tasks, like punch your way out of a cul-de-sac and do a bunch of things. And this video does not have sound because there's nothing to cheer about. It turned out that the next time I did this, the students did really poorly. And what happened was, when the tasks became more complicated, all of a sudden the students, they stopped being systematic. They started writing a bunch of if statements instead of actually designing controllers in a careful manner. And what seemed to happen was, all of a sudden, the task became so complex that they forgot all this stuff that we've done in class and actually just started whipping together code, hacking together things that barely worked. So I got a little annoyed by this and decided, something has to be done to solve this, which led to the title of this plenary, which is, how do you actually bridge this theory-practice gap in a meaningful way? Not just for little toy examples, but truly complex robotics problems where students learn the math and uses the final value theorem to make robots do non-trivial things, right? And to make it even a little more weird, I'm going to actually not bridge this theory-practice gap in a conventional way. I'm going to do it on a massive scale, kind of by mistake. I didn't set out to teach over 100,000 students control theory, but that kind of happened because I got annoyed by the failed robotics experiment I did in class. So to do this, I want to talk about two things actually today. The first is my control MOOC. MOOC stands for Massive Open Online Course, right? And the MOOC, let's say, revolution that never really became a revolution is probably 5 years old now. Sebastian Thrun rolled out his AI course in 2010. Coursera came online in 2011. And it's still unclear what these MOOCs are really good for. Going back to Mikolas's point, I don't think we've actually understood at all what we should do with them, but they're interesting. So I'm going to talk about my experiences with this. Then I also want to talk about remote access test beds as a companion piece to MOOCs. But to start with, let me tell you about my robotics problem, right? So I really needed students to learn the theory and to solve complex robotics tasks in one class. So I started looking at how people did this, and I learned about this thing called the flipped classroom. And I thought, that sounds kind of cool, where the students learn the material somewhere else, and they come to class and demonstrate what it is that they've learned in interesting projects. So somehow I needed to outsource the theory part. I wanted lots of hands-on projects that weren't toys, but actual real state-of-the-art research frontier robotics problems. And I started looking around at these new things called MOOCs. Right? And in 2012, when I started thinking about this, there were really no engineering MOOCs out there. They were almost all computer science. There were a handful of introduction to circuits or introduction to thermodynamics, but very, very basic things. I needed a MOOC that taught upper-level engineering control theory, right? Because I had my students at Georgia Tech that are juniors and seniors that needed to actually learn the material that I would normally teach in class. So I decided, you know what, I'll make my own. Right? So I whipped together a MOOC that I call Control of Mobile Robots. Georgia Tech at that point had started talking about doing a MOOC, so I produced the first MOOC out of Georgia Tech just to try to figure out what was going on. And it was absolutely staggering what happened. So the first year, I had 40,000 students. It's a ridiculous number, right? Second year, I had over 60,000 students. And this thing has now kept going, and I've had over 150,000 students in my course. The first thing you should know, by the way, is whenever a MOOC person gives you these numbers, they're lying. These numbers are the number of people that sign up for the course. Has nothing to do with the number of people that actually take the course. But that's the number we like to give because we sound bigger and cooler if we have 150,000 students. But the scale, regardless, was insane, right? I had no intention that it would be this large because I had 30 students in my class that I wanted to take the MOOC. That was pretty much it. And the way all these MOOCs are structured are around weekly modules. And the modules are broken down into these sub-modules or nuggets, right? And they're typically around 5 to 11 minutes long because research has shown that people that grow up watching YouTube, they can only concentrate online for 5 to 11 minutes. So that's what you need to do. That's hard. That's hard when you're teaching, right? Because we're used to the 1 hour format, right? We like to tell a story over an hour. Now I had to take a concept and distill it down into a 6-minute little chunk. So that was complicated. I ended up doing 7 weeks, 8 sub-lectures for each week. And then when you have 40,000 students, there's no way you can grade homework, right? So you have to do it automatically, which implies that you pretty much have to have multiple choice, which is also impossible when you're doing control theory, right? I mean, multiple choice and control, it's not natural for us. Not only do you need a right answer, you need multiple wrong answers that are wrong in interesting and educationally informative ways, right? So this to me was a problem. In the first year, I kind of messed up the multiple choice questions. I didn't have them as, I thought, like normally when you teach, you kind of whip together the homework as you go along. The next year I actually had to do this rather carefully. So if you took these weekly quizzes, multiple choice, you answered 60% correctly, you passed the course and you got a certificate. If you answered 90% correctly, you passed with distinction and you got a certificate. And this certificate, I thought, was literally worth the piece of paper it was written on. I mean, it's a piece of paper that says, oh, you've taken this course. By the way, this is not a course, Georgia does not endorse it, blah, 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 blah. It's not official, right? Regardless of that, people care deeply about these things. People have applied to grad school with these certificates. People have applied to jobs with these certificates. I get calls from employers that are considering hiring people from all over the world who've taken my course, and I need to now verify what they did in the class, right? Which is a little complicated when you have 40,000 people on the list. The other thing that happens is, just like a regular class, people complain about the grade, right? And now you multiply that by 40,000. So people care deeply about this in a surprising manner. But from my point of view, the reason I did this was I wanted to try to flip the classroom. Right? So I want to say a few words about the flipped class. I taught a course on embedded and hybrid control systems. I'm not going to tell you too much about it, but here's the beginning of the syllabus. And the two things I want to point out when, at least for me, attempting one of these flips is, first of all, you need a teaching assistant that really has his or her act together, because it's complicated. It's actually more work and it takes more time to do a flipped class than a regular lecture, even though it seems like you're just hanging out with the students, but it just takes more. The other is, it's actually more work for the students also. So in this case, the students had to take my MOOC, they had to pass it with distinction, and then show up in class and demonstrate what they've learned. So this was a Tuesday, Thursday class. So on Tuesdays, the students showed up in class and we talked about the material. And on Thursday, they programmed robots. And that was really how we structured it. And I just want to say a few words about the flipped class. That's not really the point of the talk, but I want to say just how I perceived it. So first of all, I was absolutely delighted with the outcome from a practical point of view. What I attempted, which is to have systematic solutions to non-trivial problems, I actually felt was wildly successful. The students really liked it. And the first time I did this, so 2013 was the first time I attempted the full flip, was super excited until I realized that, you know what, I have to hand out grades now. So I had no quizzes, I had no final exam. I ended up going to my boss, the chair of the School of Electrical and Computer Engineering, and said, I am going to have to hand out 35 A's. I hope you're okay with that. And he said, oh, okay. So that was something I actually didn't think through. The next year I did, though. So what I did the next year is, first of all, on Tuesdays, they had to actually take a mini quiz just to show what they've learned in the MOOC. And then I actually had a final exam, and we built up these demonstrable things that needed to be shown in the different projects for different grades, and that worked. The other thing about the weekly quizzes in class that I realized was really important is, in order to ensure that the students are actually synchronized with the MOOC, you have to have this kind of synchronizing signal, like a little quiz. And that seems to be how almost everyone is structuring these things. That's all I'm going to say about that. Let's talk about the MOOC instead for a bit. So here's what it looked like. Week 1, introduction to controls, just basically what's control theory. Talked about robots, models, sensors, linear systems. Did 1 week of stability and controllability and observability. Just burned through it. Control design. Then we talked about hybrid systems, because you need that when you're doing robotics, and then some more practical things. And the way it looked was something like this.
So in the previous lecture, we saw that eigenvalues play a fundamentally important role.
So this is me sitting in a studio with a camera smack in my face talking, right? And that is really uncomfortable. It's also hard to know when what you're saying actually is boring, or if it's hard, or just how people respond, right? So I ended up very quickly realizing that I have to have a graduate student, put that graduate student in the studio so I could actually lecture to the student. So at least I had one person that could give me some kind of real-time feedback by looking bored or checking his or her email as I was talking. So then we took that, and then that was imposed on now the screen that I had that I could annotate. So here's me, I'm chit-chatting, right?
Where we had two robots, and we could.
Point being is you always have this talking head superimposed because, again, research shows that people pay way more attention when you know who it is that is talking. And it really doesn't have to be me. Like Microsoft realized that it could have a paperclip in the Microsoft Office package. As long as there's someone in charge, people pay more attention. So could be me, could be Johnny Depp or someone else. So we did that. It could draw on this little thing. And then I also wanted to make sure that the students got some kind of practical exposure. So we did a bunch of experiments also.
Designed a closed-loop controller for achieving rendezvous. We are going to deploy it on our old friends, the Kipera mobile robots. So what we will see now are these two robots actually executing this algorithm. And we will be using the same go-to-goal controller as we designed earlier to achieve this. And as always, I have JP Delacroix here to conduct the affairs. And practically, we're going to see two robots crashing into each other, which is exciting in its own right. But intellectually, what we're going to see is the state of the system asymptotically driving into the null space of our new A matrix. And the reason for that is, as we've seen, this matrix has 1 0 eigenvalue, which means that the system is critically stable and the states approach the null space. So, JP, without further ado, let's see a robotic crash. So we see they're immediately turning towards each other and
So anyway, this was my attempt of infusing the A matrices with a little bit of life, right? So, having said that, this is how we prepped everything. And then, let me tell you what happened. So, January 2013, I launched the MOOC with 40,000 students, right? And the thing that happens is you have these online open forums where the students have opinions and help each other. And the MOOC started, and the forums more or less blew up with complaints right away. So here's a quote. "Oh bollocks, matrices and integrals together." People were complaining, I signed up for a robotics course, this is a math course, why are we doing this, this is stupid. And it's even worse than that. After 1 week, I'd gone from 40,000 to 12,000. So if you teach a course, right, and day 1 you have 40 students, day 2 you have 12, you're doing something fundamentally wrong. Right? So we were kind of freaking out about this. This drop was very dramatic. People were complaining very, very loudly. But at the same time, luckily for me, I was still teaching a course on campus at Georgia Tech where the students had to take this MOOC, so I had no choice, right? So we decided to go with a Tom Petty principle. I won't back down. So we decided, you know what? Control theory needs math. There's no way around this. So fine, we did that, and very quickly it seemed like that the people that really didn't like all of this math left. So people started saying nice things, thanks for not dumbing it down. People were getting more and more excited about the course. But the bleeding continued, right, down to 9. And then towards the end, people asked for a second one. What made me really, really excited was already during the first installation of this MOOC, other classrooms started to be flipped around the world, right? So actually in real time, University of Hawaii flipped their own class around my MOOC. And I think right now, currently as we speak, there are 5 courses being taught, not at Georgia Tech, where the students take this MOOC and then in class, they actually do robotics experiments. So that was deeply satisfying, right? That all of a sudden, I'm lecturing people in Honolulu. That's kind of cool. Anyway, we ended up with around 7,000 students at the end. And this was kind of the chronology of the first year. This is what it actually looked like. So when I said 40,000, it's a gigantic lie, right? That's the number of people who said, yes, I would very much like to take this course. And that's the only thing they ever do. I think a lot of us have signed up for courses. Oh, that sounds fun. I want to learn more about French poetry. And then click, and then that's it. But around 17,000 students showed up for week 1. So light blue here means active users, and active means someone who either watched the video, did the homework, or just wrote something on a forum, someone that engaged with the material. And this went from 17,000 to the 7,000 number that we talked about. The dark blue are the number of people that took the quizzes. And it's decayed down, and at the end, these are the number of certificates. It was 3,900. Right? So roughly, or almost 10%, which I was actually kind of depressed about. I thought this was not a particularly encouraging number. Again, if I have 40 students in my class and 4 people take the final exam, that's pretty sucky. But at the same time, that's 4,000 people. That's without a doubt more people that I'm ever going to educate during my career at Georgia Tech. So that's pretty profound. The other thing that it turns out is that this is almost twice the standard retention rate. So here's the normal retention rate at the MOOC, and I think, to me, the reason it was so high is this MOOC was actually not dumbed down. It wasn't pretending to be, oh, this is a graduate class at Stanford, and then it's not, right? This was an actual course that my actual students had to take. And to me, that's the real reason, I still think, why we have a much higher retention rate than the other MOOCs out there. Having said that, I still felt that the students in my class, they were doing good, they were benefiting from this. The students that were not in my class were not necessarily benefiting from the practical side of things. So the second year, I actually wanted to truly attempt a bridging of this theory-practice gap. Right? So we were thinking about how do we do this? We want to make sure everyone gets a robot. I can't afford to send robots to everyone. I don't want to sell robots because then all of a sudden I'm a robot salesman. So what we did is we developed something that we called the QuickBot, which was a kit. It's a differential drive robot. It had, if you wanted, infrared sensors on it. You could go Arduino or BeagleBone. You could go Wi-Fi, or you could have it charged or programmed via a cable. Depending on the options, the price point was around $140 to $200 for buying the components, right? It's possible to do this cheaper, but then you have to solder more, because we wanted people to actually be able to assemble this thing. And then we let people actually build this thing, and it was an optional part of the MOOC. One thing that was cool about it is that quickly people started buying these things. And there is an electronic online vendor called SparkFun. They quickly detected somehow that an unusual number of particular type of wheel encoders were being sold. So they contacted us and asked if they could bundle it. So they started bundling this thing, and I don't know how many really were sold, but through SparkFun, we know that over 1,000 kits or bundles were sold. So that was exciting. The weird thing now is, so back then, you couldn't do this, right? It didn't exist. Now, if you go to Amazon and you type robot kit, there are 20, 25 different varieties of this. SparkFun, by the way, sells their own kit now that, if I turn on the mic, I could tell you that it looks eerily like this, but I'm not going to tell you that. But anyway, that means we had QuickBots, and I don't know how many were made, but there were easily thousands of them. One thing that I think is absolutely delightful about this is there is a YouTube channel called the QuickBot channel that I have nothing to do with, that we have nothing to do with, where people are still doing experiments. I review papers where people use the QuickBot. There are actually courses being taught, one at MIT right now, where they're using the QuickBot as the platform that's being used. So that was really an exciting side effect that I didn't expect. Some of the components right now are a little dated, so I think if you were to build your own QuickBot, there are things you might want to update, but that was cool. So with that, let me take a step back then and talk a little bit about the good, the bad, and the ugly, because I promised we would talk about this. Let me start with the bad. The first bad is that 40,000 is actually strictly greater than 40. And even though on the course it says, please do not contact the instructor directly, go via the forum, you still get a flood of emails from very nice, well-meaning people. So we're a robotics club in India, we need a mentor, or I'm a high school student in Colombia, I have questions, right? And there's no way you can just respond to that. And that was kind of heartbreaking, I thought, that you just can't deal with it. And then the flip side also, which is people complaining about grades. Oh, this is incorrectly graded, I was so close, and this and that. I mean, there's no way you can deal with that at that magnitude. And it doesn't scale gracefully. Let me just put it that way. The other thing is that it takes an incredible amount of time to to produce one of these MOOCs. The conventional wisdom is that it's 3 times. For me, it took almost more. So 3 times the production of a regular course, a regular new course. So I don't know if I would have done it had I known how much time it would take. But the beautiful aspect of that, though, is that the second time it takes no time at all. And actually, I'm teaching this course right now, as we speak, without having to do a single thing. Right? I have a teaching assistant that's engaging with the students. And once a week, I go online and I have some opinions, and that's all I do. So after you've done it, it just helps itself. Engineering is tricky, and it's not clear that the online format is particularly well suited for it. One is we have steeper prereq chains than almost any other discipline, right? Maybe excluding the sciences, right? Where to do controls, you need to do differential equations, you need to do systems, Laplace transforms, Fourier transforms, circuits, and then maybe you can start, right? So you actually have to have this kind of chain. Again, I still think the assignment piece was one of the hardest parts of this. How do you actually construct meaningful multiple choice questions? The lab piece, I mean, we try to solve it by getting the QuickBots out there, but I don't think it's the ultimate solution. The other thing that I was not prepared for, so when you're a professor, right, life is rejection. That's just part of life. Your grant proposal is rejected, your paper is rejected, students may say bad things about you on the teaching evaluations. That's life. And those of us who enjoy this profession, we have to learn to not take it personally, because if we do, we're going to be miserable, right? So that's just part of life. One thing, though, that happens the second you get on the internet is that the meanness just increases dramatically. So, if you mess up a minus sign when you're lecturing, right? I'm sure all of us has done that. Someone will say, "Excuse me, shouldn't that be minus?" And you go, "Yes, it should," and you fix it and you move on. I literally messed up a minus sign in one of the slides the first year, and this firestorm erupted on the forums about what a disgrace to Georgia Tech I was and how I should not be allowed to teach because I clearly don't even know algebra. Right? That was kind of weird. The thing that I really didn't like was, like I said, I'm used to rejection because I'm a professor and that's what we do. TAs, though, the student teaching assistants are not, and people were attacking them as well, and I did not enjoy that one bit. That actually made me rather upset, and one person actually had to disqualify from the course because he was almost harassing one of the female TAs, and I wasn't expecting that. Let's talk about the good instead then. So first of all, I think there is huge appetite for serious engineering content out there. The vast majority of my students, to be honest, were males in the age 25 to 45 in North America and Europe, right? So with a science, engineering, or computer science background. Right? So maybe I didn't reach that many, but there were also people that I would never, ever have reached, who would never have been exposed to this kind of stuff. There were people in Africa. There were women in Afghanistan who took my course. That was really, really cool. And there is appetite for it. I also think this idea of a flipped classroom is interesting. I think some classes are really well suited. You don't have to do a full flip. You can do a partial flip. But I think that there is lots to be had in terms of using resources somewhere else. And then using that to make the in-class experience richer. I truly believe that that's true. It's also personally incredibly rewarding, right? I mean, this idea or this possibility of reaching more people than you would ever do, and other kinds of people, that is satisfying. At least to me, I found that deeply rewarding. And then the last positive thing is, these MOOCs are mysterious. So let's get back to the question about what's next, right? I don't even think we know what MOOCs are good for yet, right? But I do think that they add something. Right now, there is just a smorgasbord of MOOCs out there, but I don't think we've harnessed the power of the MOOC at all in the classroom. And in particular, in engineering disciplines, I think there is a lot of value to be had if we do this correctly. And I think we can be leaders in figuring out what's going on, because it's not as simple as just, hey, here's a course, go take it, now you're a certified controls engineer. But I think it frees us up, for instance, to be more hands-on, as opposed to having the same linear systems class being taught across the world in 200 classrooms at the same time. I mean, there's something to be had for that, or said for that. I want to show you the ugly, though. I promised you the ugly. I was interviewed by a magazine in the middle of the first MOOC, and I said, oh, this is the closest a professor can ever get to feeling like a rock star, is what I stupidly said. One of the students in class thought that was funny and drew this picture, which is me pretending to be a rock star. So that's the ugly. Let's get rid of that. Anyway.
Why you call ugly?
Okay, fine. The handsome. The good, the bad, and the handsome is what I should call this talk. Thank you, Bozana. Anyway, the one thing, though, that I didn't feel that was solved particularly elegant was this idea of a lab. The QuickBot was fun, but really, I wanted more from a lab point of view. And in fact, let me show you. This is the picture that was on the first slide of this talk. This is my lab. I really, really like my lab. I have worked on it for a long time. It has, flying robots. It has ground robots. It has humanoids. Even has a QuickBot. And it's fun. But there is something there are a number of things that are missing when you show pictures like this. Here are some of them. One is, it takes an army of smart students and postdocs to maintain a lab or something to this scale. Right? I mean, just making it run is not simple. It also costs a lot of money. Right? I mean, easily in the robotics domain, in the multi-agent robotics domain, labs run in the order of multiple millions of dollars, which is why there are so few really good multi-agent robotics labs out there, I think, in partial. Right? And then you have this guy again, the baseball player, who said, in theory and practice are the same, in practice they're not. So most of us that grew up proving theorems, we don't necessarily. My PhD is in applied math, right? I mean, I didn't know how to do this until I kind of ran into smart students. Now I know, but there is also on the faculty side a rather large theory-practice gap when it comes to starting to set up these types of labs, to be completely honest. So how do we solve this? Well, I think the answer is kind of direct, and this is by no means my idea. But why not make these labs remotely accessible to other people? So I want to tell you a little bit about the stuff that's going on in remote access test beds right now in my lab and also broader. So there are lots of potential users for, if I could make, let's say, my lab remotely accessible. High school students could all of a sudden program swarms of robots. The MOOCers, you know what? They could actually run their code on my robots. That would be really, really cool. But from my point of view, there is a very, very large group of other people that could benefit from this, and these are the researchers. So instead of making remote access educational labs, there are quite a few of those. What about making remote access research labs that can also serve educational purposes? Right? So if you're a junior faculty member in the United States, you're given a bag of money that's called a startup, and then said, okay, go build a lab, and in 6 years we're going to see whether or not you get tenure. And what almost all of them do is spend way too much time setting up the lab, which is not what they should be spending their time doing. So what if a junior faculty member could just say, hey, I'm going to start by running my code on this guy at Georgia Tech's lab, right? I went last year to a conference called Swarms, which focuses on biologically inspired multi-agent systems. And a lot of biologists were there. And all of them, at the last slide, had a picture of a robot that said, this could be used for robotics. Right? What if biologists could run code, they can program a little bit in MATLAB, run code on actual multi-robot systems? If you go to CDC, you see there are session after session on multi-agent systems. Right? This is theoretical multi-agent robotics. What if they could actually try all their stuff on our codes or on our robots? And then, there are lots of places that can't simply afford the investment in building these kinds of infrastructures. So I think, from my point of view, once I realized I wanted to do remote access, the main focus became remote access for research, and then education becomes a side gig. And I went to the National Science Foundation in the US and said, I want to build remote access research test beds. And they got extremely excited about it. They got so excited that there is a call coming out across all of National Science Foundation in actually next year, and it's based on this idea of why don't we all share or somehow share each other's research platforms? So they actually started running these workshops. So before there becomes a program, there has to be workshops. So the first workshop was in November last year. I was organizing it, and it was called Accessible Remote Testbeds, or ART. Actually, when I started organizing it, I called it Remote Access Testbeds, but the National Science Foundation didn't like that because the acronym was RAT, and they said, we can't have a RAT program, we have to have an ART program. But anyway, this is happening right now, and they're going to fund remote access testbeds in smart grid, in traffic systems, in cybersecurity, wireless networking, and so forth. From my point of view, though, what I got from the National Science Foundation is what's called an MRI, which stands for a major research instrumentation, to build something that I call the Robotarium. It's a terrarium for robots, right, where you can access it remotely and openly. You can just upload your code and run it. My ambition is that it has massive reach, but more importantly, I really would like more people to have access to robots, because right now there are all these great ideas that don't come to fruition, not because they're not good ideas, but because they don't have access to the hardware. Right? And then this is something that I think is kind of important. Research happens largely in isolation, more than it should, I think. People are redeveloping the same or reinventing the same wheels, but what if someone could actually write the world's greatest obstacle avoidance controller, put it on the Robotarium, and then I could use it, or some other researcher could use it, and we can actually build on each other's contributions a little bit. That to me is a no-brainer. So this is the picture I presented to the National Science Foundation. Is anyone from Vienna here? Okay, so it turns out that this thing is a newly renovated concert venue associated with the Vienna Chamber Orchestra. This is my Photoshop abilities. I put some robots in there, and I told the National Science Foundation, this is what I want to build. This is what it looks like now. So it's a little table with some miniature robots on it, where you can upload code and run experiments. This is the first version. I mean, it's going to be great in a few years, but right now it's a tabletop version of it. But we built it, and we actually started running things on it. So in October of this year, we ran our first, this was remote, but we were running it. So it started actually running in October. This is, right now they're doing something called rectangular pursuit, which is a particular type of algorithm, right? But the point is, we have robots that are now, you can program remotely and have them do things. The reason we wanted them to be small initially is, momentum is, what? Mass times velocity, right? So the smaller the mass, the less damage they make to themselves, right? So what's your name? Atanos. So let's say Atanos, you program the robots. I'm sure you're phenomenal, but I don't know that you're not going to break my robots, right? I cannot trust fully that. So the question is, how do I make sure? Well, one way of doing it is to make them small. So we ran some experiments where we actually had them crash into each other on purpose to see if we could break them. This is known as the rendezvous problem, where they're supposed to meet, and in this case they were fine. We managed to break them by slamming them into each other. So what we need to make sure, though, is that people can use this thing without breaking it, but it's still being a meaningful research platform. In fact, we need some way of avoiding collisions between robots that is as graceful and minimally invasive as possible for this to be a useful instrument. Right? So here's a picture of what I think is the most famous robotic collision. This was during the DARPA Urban Challenge, where in 2007 there were self-driving cars driving around. This actually, a lot of the teams then went to Google and Apple to start their self-driving car program. So this was kind of before. And here's the Cornell team. This is the MIT team. And they collided, and it was really exciting. I had a car too. I also collided. It's a Porsche. Right? And here something happens to the GPS, and we can laugh about it, but this is a year of my life that just drove straight into a K-rail. It's horrifying. Actually, what was even weirder turned out that this thing right there is a Regal laser scanner that costs $120,000, and we used it as a bumper. Anyway, we need to avoid this, right? So how do we build a remote access system that people can actually use for education and research that isn't breaking, right? So we want to design minimally invasive, provably with the least amount of disruption to what we want to do. So here are two robots, right? They're away, they're about to collide, right? But they're green, the arrows here, because they can still avoid a collision. All hope is not lost. Well, one way of saying that is if you form the joint state space, right? And say, well, the set S is the safe set. As long as you're in the interior, you're fine. Actually, as long as you're on the boundary, you're fine. But when you fall out of this, collisions can no longer be avoided. Or you could do level sets and say as long as the scalar function is strictly positive or strictly non-negative, it's possible to avoid collisions. Negative means bad. If you use this formulation, you can actually formulate a problem that says, here comes a user. Right? Oh, I want to try this thing. I'm taking a MOOC on control theory. This is what I want the robots to be doing right now. And I'm going to say, you know what, fine. I'm going to not quite let you do that. I'm going to let you do you, which is as close as possible to what you want to do, subject to this safety constraint, right? Which is really a pairwise constraint between the robots. This is what one kind of would like, because this would be minimally invasive. The problem, first of all, is that X is in the state, right? It's a constraint on the state, and I'm minimizing over U, and here there is no coupling, so this is nonsense. Right? So what you need to do is couple it, and the way you do this, I think, correctly is to use what's called control barrier functions, where you take the derivative, this is the standard trick also in optimal control, where you take the derivative of the constraint so that the control action falls out, right? And this is what's called a zeroing control barrier function because it actually allows you to get up to the boundary of the safe set. So with this, you can actually provably ensure what's called forward variance of the safe set, meaning if you start safe, you stay safe. This is actually a theorem, even though I didn't call it a theorem, but this is the one theorem, right, that says the safe set is forward invariant and minimally invasive, which means that we provably have a way to take code that's designed to not be safe and avoid collisions, right? So here are 4 robots that are actually asked to slam into each other, and when they get too close, we just deal with it by letting the barrier certificates kick in. And this is actually needed for these research testbeds to be useful. The key to make this work, so collision avoidance is not trivial in general, but the key to make this work is that everyone agrees on what's going on. Right? So we actually share the responsibility. So we were a little interested in seeing just what would happen if we didn't share the responsibility. Then we're no longer minimally invasive, and we actually ran an experiment where we had a big robot that just didn't care, that's just going for it, and these little robots think that they're going to do the right thing. So here's what this looks like when one of the robots doesn't care. So the big robot, the little guys are saying, oh yeah, we're all going to help out here, and then they go, oh shoot. So no longer minimally invasive, right? But at least provably safe. So right now, when you run things on the Robotarium, you can either convince us in simulation that what you're doing is safe, or you're forced to run it with these control barrier certificates on top of it. And we actually, in November, had our first true remote research experiment. This was Jorge Cortes out of UC San Diego, who had a cyclic pursuit algorithm he wanted to test, and this is what it looked like. This was the first experiment. And it's not that great, and he was telling me that we were doing it wrong, but we weren't. What happened was, he's one of these really smart theoretical roboticists. It turned out that his algorithm was critically dependent on certain parameters that weren't exact here, so he had to robustify it, and then it became fine. So to me, this was actually highly successful that the first experiment kind of worked. So this was in November. So now fast forward, 7 months. We have a system with 25 robots up and running. So far, 7 remote research groups have used them. So San Diego, there's a university in Guatemala that's used it. In fact, this is a professor from Guatemala who wanted to Skype in to see the experiment. And what you do is you upload code, you run the experiment, you get the video stream back, and you get the measurements back. So you get what's going on. University of Texas, Dallas, Tokyo Institute of Technology, Toronto, Vanderbilt, and CMU. We're building. I'm hoping that this is going to be huge, where a lot of research groups that should actually be able to try their distributed algorithms on real robots will be able to. But I promised that this actually had something to do with education. So we launched it last semester in class at Georgia Tech, where students in it's called Network Control Systems. It's a graduate class where the final project was implement anything on the Robotarium. Didn't tell them what, they could just try anything, right? And I had 85 students in that class. Right? So it was a large graduate class, and all of them did it. I call it remote because they had to upload it remotely. Most of them preferred to be by the Robotarium and look at the robots as they were actually moving, so they were physically right next to it, even though they were using the remote functionality. And right now, as we speak, we're developing a follow-up, finally, to this first MOOC called Control of Multi-Robot Systems, where the students are actually going to have to, or we don't know if it's mandatory yet or not, have the option at least to run their code on the Robotarium as part of the online experience. And to me, that serves as a potential way of bridging this theory-practice gap. In fact, let's go back to the bridge, right? We started with the PID regulator, which was bothering me. I like PID very much, but students either could reason about it, but not implement it, or not reason about it. So in my mind, what this talk has really been about has been the MOOC as a way of outsourcing the theory part, meaning it sits on the Maxwell side of the bridge, where this is a place where students can go and get the theory and then demonstrate mastery. While the Robotarium is a place where you can actually, on a massive scale, test your ideas in practice. And I'm by no means saying that what I've done is particularly good, but at least it's an attempt to bridge this thing on a scale that is larger than what we're normally used to. So with that, I want to say thank you, and first of all point out that the Robotarium is indeed open for business. So if you go to robotarium.org, you get instructions for how to upload code and so forth. Right now, it's still in a closed mode, which means before you get access, you have to send an email either to me or one of the postdocs on the project, and we'll give you access to it. I should also point out that nothing happens in a vacuum, so people pay for it. And more importantly, I have a large group of talented students and postdocs, as well as colleagues who've worked on some of the stuff that I've talked about. So if anything that I told you seemed reasonable and exciting, it's probably thanks to one of the people here. And if there were things you didn't like about the talk, I suggest we blame the organizers for inviting me. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, thank you for a very nice presentation. Question, comment, like, please.
In your remote lab, how do you recharge the robots? You recharge them manually, or there are an automatic?
So it's automatic. We have power strips on the side, so when the robots are low, they go and recharge. I want them to be always on, meaning the dream is that this thing just exists and no one is around, but there are always people running experiments on some part of the world, right? And when robots get low on energy, they go and recharge, and a new robot joins it. But we're not quite there yet, but that's the mechanism. Yeah.
Please. So what's the current operation time for your experiments?
Meaning how quickly does it, what's the gap between uploading code and actually running it?
How long are they able to run?
Oh, I see. So we've run half an hour so far, which is pretty good. But it's not always on. It's not 24, 48 hours. The biggest thing right now is, so I want to make sure that, so first of all, I want to make sure that people start using it because I like the idea. But at the same time, I also want to make sure that the first people that use it know what they're doing, so they go and tell their friends about how awesome this is. So the time, not the actual runtime, but the gap between uploading code and running it is right now, you have to, someone manually has to do something. Basically, you have to actually show in simulation that it works before we're willing to let you run without the barrier certificates. We're hoping to get that automated in the future. Yeah.
Maybe I would give one note. The beginning, e-learning seemed to be something that's not very scientific. From my experience at our university, how it was expected. Accepted people going to, when applying to position as the research director, one dean gave me a question, Mikuláš, you are excellent in teaching and education, but why do you not focus on research? You still think this education is against research? Some people have problems to visit AC symposia because they have very similar behavior in their surroundings. Their bosses think education is not research, and we should focus on research. So you think football could be played in just small clubs without having great number of young children playing on different playgrounds and developing basic skills? It happened in our ice hockey representation. We won championship, world championship several times, but now ice hockey in Slovakia is something for elite families, the high financial demands, and Slovakia is going down because we don't have young children playing ice hockey. I think it's something behind also behind MOOCs and so similar development.
Yeah, but I actually, there wasn't a question, but I got to say personally, I think it's absolutely insane to separate the two, right? I mean, research and education are really two pillars to the same thing, right? I mean, we're advancing knowledge and we're educating people that are going out and making great things in the world. And you can't, if you get rid of one, the other one would fall without a doubt, no matter which one you get out. So in my mind, also research as an educational tool has been proven over and over again to be a really effective tool for students to engage with the material.
I just wanted to add, this is in some sense the last several years I've been notified that, as you mentioned, that I cannot go for education, I cannot get support to go for education conference. The reason why I believe there is some kind of misleading is in the United States, I'm pretty sure in Europe is similar, we have that education school at our university. So somehow, when the name of the conference is Advances in Education, somehow this is labeled by education school. And so I believe it's misunderstanding because what you've heard here, you cannot separate, this is what we will be saying, why I call that panel first, just to break that kind of misunderstanding. It's impossible to separate research from education, in my judgment.
I also think that a vast majority of innovation and creativity in the educational space happens not in educational schools, but they happen in classrooms all around the world all the time. Right?
This is my major point. It happens, and as you started saying, and you look, whatever you do, my area of research is adaptive, stochastic adaptive control. I love using that because this is real life. What you do, you adapt. You started with the course 40,000, you drop, you adapt. You adapt to what you have next time. I believe that you use what you learned before and so on. So it's adaptation. So in my judgment, for example, in mine, I learn from the classroom, as you said, what I know, what supports my research and vice versa. So it's interplay. So I've been, for all those years that I was chair of the committee, Technical Committee on Education, and education in Ifac is also additionally placed under social system, which is also total misunderstanding. So that's why I brought that education to the top, because that was motivation, but I still believe that the name of this particular symposium, Advances in Education, maybe should be considered for changing the name. And that's why I started initiating the discussion, integrating research and education to avoid somehow misunderstanding and pass message.
I've got a sort of question and a comment.
Oh, that's a classic one too, right?
This issue about MOOCs, because my university has started playing with them, and I don't know whether your university's got the same issue. The big question is the finance. You can put this MOOC out there, and you can get your 40,000 or whatever, and 5,000 finished. But as an institution, you're doing it for free. Yes. There's no money coming back, and they're very expensive to make. So there's an interesting question. I think certainly my university, the jury's out. They're doing it just as a taster, but it's costing them a lot of money. And people are going to ask, why spend all this money to produce a MOOC that has no benefits? So that's a sort of comment, and I presume you're in a similar position. But one of the things I did agree with you, and I think this is something Ifac needs to do better, is this issue about replication of lectures, materials, etc., and having some form of central repository of validated resources that everybody across the world can say that's a good resource, and we can direct our students to it.
Yeah, I mean, all my students learn convex optimization from Stephen Boyd. Right? I mean, they take his online course, or it's not even a course, it's his lecture videos. I think that's a great idea. Let me make a comment to your comment. I think the MOOC business model is still very murky, and for universities, I mean, you really got to ask, why is it you're doing it? What is it you hope to get out of it? And I think part of it, so Georgia Tech made the decision that, this thing is happening. We need to make sure that we're out there somehow so that we're positioned when people figure out what's going on, right? That's one. I think, though, from my point of view, I have actually benefited tremendously from the exposure I got outside of the MOOC setting. So let's say my personal brand has become significantly stronger. I get better students. I get lots of students that actually have taken my MOOC, and for that reason they want to do a PhD with me, for instance. I also get contracts now from especially companies where they will call and say, hey, we took your MOOC, we want to work with you. So at an individual level, there's benefit to be had, as long as the MOOC isn't bad, because right now there are also, people have started, there are quite a few out there, right? And bad MOOCs with low production value, that's the problem. Low production value, bad MOOCs, people are just going to ignore. Right? So
certainly at my university, they took the viewpoint that the MOOCs would be developed by the centre, by liaising with academics, and they would have a professional production team for exactly that purpose. They said, we're going to do it, we need it to be.
I also think MOOCs are different for different universities. If you have an R1, so a very research-centric university, then maybe it means that you spend less time in the classroom. But if you're a research-intense or a teaching-intense university, maybe it means that you can replicate yourself across multiple sections at the same time. Or I don't know. I think it's a very unclear business model at this point. The only people that are making money so far are the MOOC providers. Like Udacity, Coursera, edX.
Do you expect something like Hollywood?
But that's a good question. Why isn't Robert De Niro teaching control theory instead of me, right? I mean, it's not clear.
I've heard suggestion even that you don't need, for example, to be in front of camera. You can hire an actor who will behave, and deliver your lecture. So it's, on the way to Hollywood, yeah? I joke. But who knows?
Well, our personal beliefs, and I think I can talk about my beliefs and our beliefs as well, are concentrating a present project we have and the EU Academy. And what we are trying to do is to leave open freely to everyone models with a general topic. For that we just collect very general concepts, and then we leave everything for everyone. And also it is always related with any kind of technology for experiments, either remote or augmented reality, virtual reality, virtual experiments and so on, simulators and so on. So what we are doing now is just trying to get everything we have in general modules with a general topic, and then try to use them as they just want to.
So I think that's a really, really good idea. There is this thing for, I mean, not advanced education, but like the Khan Academy, right? I mean, he just started putting modules up there, and you know, I have teenage daughters, and they are learning math from the Khan Academy. I mean, it's very. So I think that's a great idea, and that goes back to this idea also of having a central repository.
Yeah.
Right? I also think that, to be honest, just because you build it, it doesn't mean people will come. Right? Meaning that just because you put it up there doesn't mean that people will actually take advantage of it. So something like an official Ifac repository will mean that people have a way of accessing this that I think could be quite useful, to be honest.
In our case, we are not doing things oriented for being used in a certain way.
Yeah.
You know, and we are not using videos and so on. No, remote experiments, remote experimentation, and then also some evaluations, assessments of the user in terms of students, professionals, and knowledge base.
Yeah. To me, assessment is one of the hardest things, though. So that's excellent.
I'm proposing a central repository of resources on control systems for students and faculty to share. So I have been quite involved with ETD central repository, and we thesis dissertations, and we have a wide collection. And why should we do this for control systems or electrical engineering in general? There are so many of us spread out all over the world, and we're not collaborating. We really should. This is my proposal.
You have my vote. I vote yes. No, I think it's a great idea. And also this idea of just replicating the same effort over and over again at many different places at the same time. It's a waste of time, and I think we can become much more efficient as educators if we don't do that also. So.
And we have language issues, which is quite interesting because not the whole world speaks English. So we can, if things are in open access and with a Creative Commons license, we can translate contents into other languages and share what they're being used. I think this idea.
Could I use the original model and ask how many you are using open materials?
Well, we are producing materials and we are leaving them in open access, but they are mostly in Brazilian Portuguese. So.
Okay. Thank you once more, Magnus.
Thank you.
Now we have 30 break.